I was told to just stick to what they called being a good minister and tend to my flock. But that's what I thought I was doing by opening the doors of my church, even to Indians. And that's ultimately what the church found intolerable, that I was bringing that truth, into the pews on Sunday and letting those people who had been silenced for so long speak. And I'm still trying to do that in the work I do.
Well, didn't any of the church ministers sit down and sit with you and say, these are the rules and regulations, you're not to mess with the natives and this is what happens?
They weren't that blatant, but it was they were subtle warnings I got. There was a fellow, Bill Howie, who was head of the church. He was kind of like the regional rep for the United Church on Vancouver Island. And he came over to me after my first Presbytery meeting, which is where all the ministers get together a few times every year. And I had made a comment at that meeting about how it was odd to me that there were no Native people in our churches and we should begin to look into the reason why. And Bill Howie came over and he sat down next to me, and with his big flashy smile, he said, you have a very promising career in the United Church and a young family to support, and if I were you, I'd be careful about comments and looking too much into the Native people. So
did you get it?
No, I mean, to me that seemed very odd he would say that, and I didn't think, I was filled with illusions then. I thought, well, this is the Church of Christ. I mean, we're not going to stab each other in the back. I mean, I was very ignorant of our own history.
There's an establishment within the United Church in Port Alberni that set out to destroy Kevin Annett, and they set out by contacting those members, which I call the cliques in Port Alberni, bring them together and discredit Kevin Annett at all costs. Because what they had to lose was the fear of course, financial retribution from the Aboriginal people, but also they didn't want to hear about murders, and they didn't want to hear about abuses that took place with the Aboriginal people, because they felt that they'd had too much to lose. And let's face it, they would. Who would want to go to a church that abused Aboriginal kids, murdered Aboriginal kids?
When these stories began to be told, you could see some of the older white people visibly wincing and getting very uptight. And I didn't know at the time what it was about. It wasn't until subsequently that I learned that there was literal skeletons in the closet of the United Church, and they certainly didn't want them to come out.
I remember back in 1992 when Kevin first invited us, I got the impression from non-Aboriginal people that attended the service that this was all fine and dandy, but it's really made a lot of them feel uncomfortable, and I got that impression by talking to a lot of them. And in fact, one of the comments made by one of the churchgoers was that they couldn't understand why Kevin was reaching out to us, the Aboriginal people of the Alberni Valley. I understood why Kevin was doing it, because there had been an alienation for a number of years, but I didn't know that the anti-Aboriginal congregation that existed there was so adamant that they didn't want anything to do with us.
What kind of people didn't they like?
Well, definitely not the poor. That one was obvious right off.
Well, there is a lot of racial discrimination.
Yeah, a lot of racial stuff. They didn't want natives in the church.
And as Kevin developed the food bank and developed a dialogue about the murders that took place in residential schools, I suddenly saw firsthand the attacks that started to come towards Kevin. It first started out as whispers, and I remember hearing from people in the Alberni Valley who used to go to the coffee shops that Kevin Annett was opening up a can of worms he shouldn't be opening up, and how dare he.
Which is why I was removed so quickly. I was just summarily fired from my job without any cause, without any due process or anything.
On January 23rd, 1995, after nearly 3 years as minister of St. Andrew's United Church, Kevin Annett was fired without cause or notice by 2 officials of the United Church, without the knowledge or consent of his congregation. Kevin was told by one of these officials, Art Anderson, that there were no charges against him and that he was not under discipline, but that nevertheless he had to submit to what Anderson called, quote, pastoral retraining and psychiatric evaluation if he was to remain a United Church minister. Anderson provided no evidence to support these requirements. At the time of Kevin's firing, his church was filled to capacity on Sunday mornings, and Kevin had just received a vote of approval for his work and ministry by 90% of his congregation.
I had no idea that it would blow up in my life to the extent that it did. I was a total innocent walking into a minefield. I thought, okay, the worst that could come out of this is they'll reprimand me and remove me and send me to another church. That's the worst that can happen. That's what I figured.
Was this your own conclusion, or did you derive that with your family?
No, I just realized that that's how you deal with a minister who doesn't fit, as they say, with his congregation, which I know is bullshit because I fit with most people there. But I knew in the power politics of the church, it's always a minority who hold the power. And these people who were the old guard, who were connected with the people who had run the residential school, who were scared shitless of Indians, who had the guilty conscience, those were the ones who had the ear of the higher-ups in the church, and I knew they were going to remove me. But I thought that they would simply, do the whole re-education thing and say, well, you're going to go and retrain, and then you can have another church. But I realized pretty quickly when all of this stuff started happening that they wanted me out. They didn't want me. It was kind of like, the Matrix when the plugs start flying out of Neo, right? Like the system looks at it and go, whoa, he's not going to fit. Flush. And they flushed me.
Kevin was a thorn in the side of the establishment, and one of the meetings that I was made aware of, it came up, well, if you want to really get rid of Kevin Annett, then what you do is you attack his wife and children. And how you attack the wife and children is you put a lot of pressure on them and say that the longer Kevin Annett continues with disclosing these murders and continuing working with the Aboriginal people, the harder it's going to be for you to feel socially acceptable in the community. And your husband shouldn't be doing this. And if your husband continues to do this, there's going to be ramifications for you and your daughters.
I didn't think that they were going to eventually, basically destroy my life, get rid of my livelihood, and help break up my family, which they did.
Where did your family? Did you talk this over with your family? Where that was church business? You didn't talk with her?
Well, eventually, when with my wife Anne, who my ex-wife now, I began to share a lot of stuff with her, and she was getting really scared about all this stuff. But what happened was, after I was fired, they went to her, and they actually offered to pay for her divorce and help her if she provided them with information. And in fact, subsequently, they gave her documents which tried to make me look like I was mentally unstable, which she used in divorce court, and she got custody of our 2 young daughters as a result. So the fact that the church would do that would actually help in the divorce to get my kids taken away from me. The fact that they would spend $250,000 to throw me out of the church, that was all telling me and other people a lot of stuff. That was telling me that there's a much bigger agenda here. They're scared, and they want me out and silenced by any means necessary. So you don't just do that to somebody who has, offended the congregation or who isn't a good minister. You don't go to that extent unless there's some other thing you're trying to hide, and that was clearly about these murdered kids and the stolen land.
I witnessed the death of Maisie Shaw.
You have as much right to call yourselves Christians as the members of the Inquisition. Where is your apology? Where did you bury the children?
But this is where we found those, we seen those little skulls.
You found them in here?
We found them in here. There was coal, like coal. See, we weren't allowed to come here.
Never at any point when I was pleading with them to stop what they were doing to my family and I, even on that level of just how it impacted me personally, there wasn't a shred of humanity in them. They were like...
You were looking in their eyes, nothing there.
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. So you know what? When that happened to me, I realized, up until then, like any of us, it's somewhat abstract. People tell you stories, and you keep wondering, well, how could they do this? When I saw what they were able to do to me, one of their own, when they turned and shredded my life mercilessly and allowed my 6- and 2-year-old daughter to go through hell, I thought, if they could do that to me, imagine what they could do to a native child who wasn't a Christian, who was dark-skinned, who wasn't part of them. Of course they could kill them.
So I watched, and she was standing at the top of the stairs, and he kicked her. She went rolling downstairs. She ended up, she was laying like this. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't moving. She wasn't crying. So I see that all the time.
Her name was Maggie. She was 2 years older than me. And she was murdered in there by a nun. She pushed out the window, 2nd story up, and she died. But nothing was done about it. We weren't allowed to see a lawyer or nothing. They just covered this up.
Jenny wouldn't cry out, and then all of a sudden, this blood just spurted all over the place, and it was on her back, and a small part of her back here. It opened up. last time I ever saw my sister.
There was two young men ran away. They got as far as Jasper, and they froze to death on the highway. And I know the exact spot that they died. It's just like all of us have that history. We know what happened to people.
When I allowed a forum for that in my church, lots of stories were told, including a whole hidden history of how the church had been selling off native land to its corporate benefactors, including Macmillan Bloedel, a big logging company at the time. And there were all these little backroom deals going on with stolen native land. And I called the church on that, and they showed me the door.
The whole process of your firing was farcical. The church knew there were 1,400 lawsuits coming down the pipe over the residential schools. I'm convinced that your removal was orchestrated from Toronto, from the church head office. I think it's obvious to me that the national office removed you because they knew of the upcoming RCMP investigation and of the land deal after Marion Best got your letter. They were in for a rough fight and didn't want dissent from a Port Alberni pulpit.
The sale and speculation of a house at First Nation land on Flores Island, Lot 363 on Canada's west coast, by the United Church of Canada, BC Provincial Government, Macmillan Bloedel and two local businessmen, was brought to light and challenged between 1992 and 1994. The two individuals primarily involved in making these disclosures, Hereditary Ahousaht Chief Earl McKenna George and United Church Minister Reverend Kevin Annett, have now been expelled from the United Church over these same events.
In October 1994, I had attended a Presbytery gathering. That's where the ministers all get together to talk over church matters. And at that Presbytery meeting, the whole issue of how land was taken from the Ahousaht's people was basically covered up and denied by the church. So I took issue with that, and I wrote this letter. Subsequently, I was fired from my pulpit. The letter is dated October 17th, 1994, and it's addressed to the members of Comox Nanaimo Presbytery. Dear members of Presbytery, I am writing this in the wake of the brief discussion at the Fall Presbytery gathering in Gold River concerning the issue of the Ahousaht's land settlement. I am both deeply concerned about the response of Presbytery officials to this issue and the way in which this matter was dealt with at Presbytery. My perspective on this issue arises largely as a result of long and fruitful discussions with the Ahousaht's, including with several tribal elders. The issue seems to be one of violated trust on our part, rather than any legalistic or documentary problem, as Presbytery officials have suggested. In a nutshell, native land was given to the Presbyterian and then United Church solely for the education and spiritual upkeep of the Ahousaht's, in particular the young people. This land was subsequently sold by the church to a private white individual. Simple justice and decency requires that our church rectify our wrong by seeking the return of the said land to the Ahousaht's and by publicly admitting our mistake. This issue has been clouded over by our Presbytery. Some officials have claimed that the Ahousaht's have created roadblocks to meeting or cannot produce appropriate legal documentation to show ownership of the land by the Ahousaht's. Sadly, these are precisely the words and accusations that a colonial system has directed against Indigenous peoples ever since we took away their land. The very fact that we are waiting for the Ahousaht's to prove their case to us, or to meet with us on our terms, reveals at best an insensitivity on the part of our church to God's call for justice towards those we have wronged. At worst, it indicates a perpetuation of the racist and oppressive relationship that has been our legacy regarding Indigenous peoples. It is not too late to reverse this legacy or the wrong we committed in regards to the Ahousaht's land issue. Indeed, it is imperative that we do so soon if we are concerned at all about our credibility and integrity in the eyes of both the Indigenous peoples here and the wider public. If we do not clearly and publicly admit our wrong on this matter and seek actively to return the land in question to the Ahousaht's people, I'll find it difficult to associate myself with the United Church on this issue. I urge Presbytery officials to meet immediately with the Ahousaht elders on their terms and come to a mutually agreed resolution to this matter that upholds our paper position of supporting native land claims. Anything short of this will expose a dangerous gap between our words and our actions.
Yours in Christ, Reverend Kevin McNamee Annett.